another Jeeping with Cool Guy video. What else have you got to do with your time? Alright folks, now we're going to do something really stupid. This is the T150 3-speed out of my 79 CJ7. Nothing wrong with it at all, other than I have no idea if anybody has ever done any service on this thing, or if there's any internal problems wearing that could show up as a potential problem in the future. And since I've got it out of the vehicle, let's open it up and see what's going on the inside. Now, I want to preface this with, I have no idea what I'm doing on this, and I am taking cues from this guy that I will put the link in the description of this, who got to be someplace on the East Coast, but the guy just really knows his old school transmissions. Let's go down this journey, down this rabbit hole, see how it all turns out, because I want to get this thing in as tip-top shape as I possibly can, and it's part of the whole restoration, so let's go. Let's start with the actual shaft itself, shifting shaft. This cap just screws off. Looks like somebody used a hammer and a chisel to kind of get it on before. Alright, so cap comes off. Then there's this inner shield, spring. Shaft just comes out straight. There apparently is a washer on the end of that, right above the pivot point. And then it looks like there's some kind of a gasket. Almost like leather, maybe? Yeah, it actually looks like a leather gasket. Paper. Oil seal, I suppose. And I guess I'm probably going to want to replace that. It'd be interesting if I could find these pieces. Put all this in a box. There's two pivot pins. The one on driver's side has rounded edges to it. It looks more like a pill. Passenger side is just completely flat. Looking at the grooves in the shift shaft, it doesn't look like there's anything in particular that's all that special about it. This doesn't look like it screws out, so I think at this point we can now take off the cover. These are 1/2 inch bolts. This one up here in the front, this happens to be some kind of a guide pin, meaning that it's got some extra thick shaft on it. I'm guessing that this pin, and I'm going to go with this pin, are the ones that align the cover. It looks like just this one up here in the front, elevated one, is that extra guide pin. These all seem to be 1 inch, maybe 3/4 inch long coarse thread grade 5 bolts with a lock washer underneath each one of them. Well, alright, this one obviously is much longer than all the other ones. Take note, back passenger side bolt is the extra long one. All the rest of them are just the 3/4 inch coarse thread, and then you have your front guide pin that goes up front here. If I recall correctly, all you need to do is just kind of lightly break the seal on the gasket and lift this off. The back fork looks really good. The front fork looks like it's got a little bit of groove cut into it. Whoa, Nelly, this makes me nervous. Alright, this is the inside of the T150. Looking at it, all the teeth look really, really super good. Oh, well, hold on. Let's get rid of this thing. Alright, this is your gasket. My God, this thing looks like it's been on here since the beginning. very distinct possibility. Looking at it just to see what I've got going on as far as like how clean everything looks, I don't see any significant wear on anything. You know, there's no chips in any of the teeth. There doesn't seem to be a lot the points on the shift, the gears, and the synchro rings all seem to be very sharp, very pointy. As we go through, I'm going to get more articulate as to what the different pieces are individually. Now I'm at the point of making the decision of like, all right, do I want to go all the way in? Yeah, unfortunately I do. Let's move on to the next step. This is first gear. This is second gear. This is third gear. This is the first and second gear synchronizer. So if you get this thing lined right, you can slide this. So now first gear is engaged. Then you can slide it the other way. And now second gear is engaged. So this is the first and second gear synchronizer off of the clutch fork. This is third gear. This large synchronizer back here, which engages the reverse gear down below. And this pretty much just slides back to engage reverse, or slides forward to engage, first gear, second gear, third gear. So that's how the synchronizers work. I think that's really kind of cool. So that's an explanation of how all the gears are put together. There'll be little rings and washers and clips in between all this. So what I think we need to do next, we need to actually remove the rear drive gear. And this consists of just this big nut and this rather large gear. I believe this is one big piece. But to be able to get that off, what you have to do is you have to take both of your synchronizers and slide them into place. So you want to engage your first and reverse gear, and then you want to engage second and third gear. So you want to slide this synchronizer over. That locks up the whole drive shaft. So now you just need to take off this nut. Let's see, it is a 1 1/4. Oh, well, that wasn't, there wasn't anything to this. Well, all right then, that was kind of anticlimactic. Threaded nut, really big washer. They've been magnetized somehow. I'm just gonna go with it's been magnetized. Take off your rear drive gear. Just make sure that you keep orientation of what side faces out. Very thin washer. And here's the rear main bearing. Both the main, the rear, and the front bearing were made in Japan as OEM. Thought that was kind of an interesting little tidbit. So now that we've got the rear gear removed, now we need to go back and put the synchronizers back into place, into neutral. Let's slide those back in. Now everything spins freely. Now you need to remove the fill plug. The fill plug happens to be a 5/16 Allen head, and that gives you access to the lower idler gear. You need a 3/16 inch long shafted punch, and there is a roll pin down in here that you'll see as soon as you pull this drain plug out. That is the retaining pin. You have to punch that through into the bottom part of the chamber. That roll pin goes right through that lower idler arm. And we're through. So what I think we need to do next is to remove the front bearing retainer, which I guess is this big thing right here. These are, again, 1/2 inch heads. These are not on there very tight. So just take a rubber mallet, kind of knock this back and forth, break that seal. This should slide right off. And there's another paper gasket that we'll have to scrape off lightly. There is an inner seal in here that just an oil seal that we'll be replacing. I have to find a kit that has all of this stuff in it. And right here is the front main bearing. It's in really good shape. Need to remove this lock ring. So I'm going to need a pair of lock ring spanners. But before we do any of that, we want to remove or drive through the counter shaft, and that will go through the case, and it should push out this rear retaining cap, and then that will release the counter shaft gear, and that will make it to where we can actually pull out the front drive shaft. Grab yourself a nice big punch. Alright, there we go. A couple of the needle bearings of that gear just fell through. I'm just going to pull out as many of these as I can right now. Oh, just heard it drop out the back. Alright, this is the counter shaft access plug right here. Pulled out all the needle bearings for the counter shaft. A whole bunch of those. They all seem to be in really good shape. We want to drive that counter shaft all the way out through the back because that's the only way that you can get to it. Want to do a visual inspection on this guy. This thing looks like it's in really good shape too. Right, so there's your counter shaft. This is a little after the fact, but once this is removed, you'll notice that the oil channel that circulates the oil basically through the bearing and back into the case is this groove, this big one right here in this. This obviously is going to line up with this one drain hole down here. Upon reassembly, just realize that this needs to point down, and that will give you a good indication as to how you put it back on. Okay, the next step, there's two lock rings. First one is the smaller one of the two, and that's on the main drive shaft, in between the drive shaft flange here and the bearing. And then there's this monster one around the outside that keeps the bearing from going further into the case. Need to remove this one first, and then we're gonna get a really big bearing puller separator, and we're gonna pull the whole thing out. The one that I got is the really large one from Harbor Freight. It can take up to 4 3/8. The problem with it is that it doesn't have the pulling element. These shafts here are actually the ones that go into the separator part, and then you clamp down on this thing and it separates the bearing out from whatever is being pressed into. These aren't pressed into the casing, they're only pressed on to the actual shaft itself. So I went to the hardware store and I got, these are actually 5/8 inch bolts. This happens to be a 7-inch long bolt. This is coarse thread. The ones that come with the separator are ultra fine threaded. I don't even know what these things are, 20 maybe, give or take. But I couldn't find a bolt that would go into this thread hole, so I just used the thread or the bolts that came with the separator as the puller part. And then I took the two nuts, and what you do is you crank them down into each other, and then this winds up becoming almost like the head of the bolt. And then from here, I'm just going to try and separate this thing out, pull it out, see if it'll go. Oh. Okay. There it is. That is that's the front drive shaft. There's all the needle bearings that went with it. You could hear them all falling down inside. Here's the first synchro ring. We'll get into the details of how these things all mesh and what you're supposed to look for in a moment. Alright, so here's our main first gear and main drive shaft. I will have to get a pair of pliers to take these off. What these things are actually called are called lock rings, not snap rings. Some people call them snap rings. The snap rings are the ones that have the little loop at the end of it with a hole that you put the pin in and you span it out. These are just pointy ends to the ring, and you need a spanning pair of pliers. They're called lock ring pliers. I'll put a link into the description of this video, and that and all the other tools that you're going to need to be able to take this apart. Before we get any deeper into this, I do want to take a look at a couple things. What you want to look for is if there's a lot of grooving in here. This seems to be nice and shiny. But the one thing I did want to note is on these synchronizing rings, the one thing that really determines whether these things are worn out or not is these inner grooves that are on the inside of the synchronizing ring. These actually mesh with this gear when you're shifting. So to figure out whether your synchronizing rings need to be replaced or not, if you can put it on here and press it down just with your hand and turn it, then these grooves are worn out. And you can see how the slots are in here. These slots are actually for oil circulation. This ring isn't even close to being worn out. It is in great shape. The other thing you want to take a look at is the teeth on the gear. These should have a nice pointed end to them. If they're rounded, then you know that that gear or the synchronizing ring is worn out. So one of the things I'm going to do is, as I start taking this stuff apart, I'm going to label every piece. And this just helps to keep me organized. Third gear synchro ring. Now we need to remove the rear bearing and adapter. I guess this is the piece that kind of slides into the Dana 20. You're supposed to do it from the inside here, and you're supposed to use a drift and a hammer and punch it out. So I took a screwdriver and I've flattened the end off of it so it's more of like just a rounded punch. Doesn't have any really grip to it. I don't have anything that's brass. You should probably use brass or more of a soft metal. So I'm not going to really kind of hammer on this thing too hard, but I'm just going to kind of tap and move it around. Just try and push it through. Alright, it is moving out. And out she comes. Alright, I flipped it around, and this is that rear bearing and adapter. Let's see, that bearing is really good too. Well, there's a little wear in there. Well, now that I've got this punched out the back, this bearing retainer and adapter are supposed to just come off. That's the way that it seems, but that isn't the case. So, since I don't have the bearing separator arm, I'm just going to use a 3-arm puller and hopefully just separate it out that way. Alright, there we go. Yeah, I can see why they want you to use a brass drift to push out this back adapter. This isn't going to affect anything, like nothing actually comes into contact with this. But I will definitely sand this down just to make sure it is nice and smooth. Note to self, use a brass drift if you can find one. Okay, there's your rear bearing and adapter. This is the main lock ring that fits inside of the groove on the back part of the transmission. That's what this rests against. And then there is another lock ring on the inside of this, which you need to remove so that you can take the bearing out. Well, I've just found the most annoying, difficult thing thus far on this transmission to replace. The difficult part about this thing is this bearing has a snap ring on the inside of this housing that's inside of a groove. And the other thing that's really annoying is that the snap ring isn't like this snap ring from the front bearing. See how it has two angled edges to it they're not like parallel, they're outside of parallel, they're more obtuse as far as the angle goes. This one has two of the cuts, but they're parallel. So this one here goes this way, and this one goes that way. So there's no way of being able to grip and push on one to kind of wedge it out. It's hard to explain, but when you try and figure it out, you'll see what I'm talking about. Logically, what you do is you just be able to put a screwdriver in here and push it out. But there's not enough of an angle on this cut end of the snap ring to really get any leverage past here, and then the screwdriver just pops out. And you can't use a hammer to punch it to get it out, because then it just rotates, because the angle on this one, there's nothing to brace it against. So I don't know a better way of doing this. This is probably not factory or service manual material. But I took a Dremel tool and I cut a notch deep enough to where I could get a screwdriver, a big screwdriver in there, and wedge it down. And then using the ring as my wedge point, very much like that. And then once I got that to the point where I could get a much smaller screwdriver up into that opened gap between the ring and the snap ring, then I was able to start wedging things out. So now I can just start using the screwdriver and wedging it out and around, and yay, we've accomplished what we needed to accomplish. Pain in the ass. So when I get this bearing pushed out, pressed out, and replaced, I am going to cut this snap ring off right about here, and then I'm going to cut a groove into it so that next time, if I ever have to do this again, I won't have to go through this process, because I didn't want, what you want to do is you want to make sure you don't cut into or damage this outer ring. So you have to be very careful when you notch this thing with your Dremel tool cut-off wheel. Okay, now we're into the serious stuff. Pick up the whole shaft, point the main shaft down, and then just lift the whole unit up and out of the housing. Hopefully a little bit more gracefully than this. And there, folks, we have the whole inner drive shaft and all the components that go with this. Now that all the main stuff are removed, now we can take out the counter shaft gear, because this thing should already be disengaged because we took out the counter shaft and everything else that goes with it. Take note that there's going to be roller bearings. What comes with this counter shaft gear are two thrust washers. They have this slotted inner part, and there's one side of these thrust washers that has a flat side. Don't know what that's for. Looking at it on the inside of the case, on these thrust washers there's a plastic or a little notch, and this plastic notch goes right into a notch on the inside of the case so that this washer doesn't rotate with the spinning of the gear. There's also a retaining ring. It retains the roller bearings. So you're going to have the thrust washer, the retaining ring, and that retaining ring holds in the roller bearings in the front part of the gear. The groove that you see right there, that is the groove that the thrust washer's plastic tab goes into. This groove down here is basically the oil drain. So as the gear oil circulates through, there's all these channels built into either the washers or the gears or the synchronizers or the casing itself to help circulate and get oil into all of the working components, so there's no dry spots anywhere inside of the transmission. So I've cleaned pretty much everything out. Here's that split pin that was holding the counter shaft and that we punched through with the 3/16 inch punch. Obviously this is going to have to be replaced. In the very bottom of the casing is a very large magnet. There's a lot of metal shavings on there, so that gives you some indication that there was some wear of either some gears or something inside of here over the course of 70,000 miles or however many miles this thing actually has on it. I'm not quite sure. So that'll obviously have to be cleaned off, but that also does a really good job of keeping all the metal shavings that do wind up building up over time from getting into the gears and causing premature wear. Then right here is the drain plug. That is the reverse idler gear. You can see on the teeth, this thing's probably going to need to be replaced. This thing looks like it's had a little bit of difficulty getting into reverse because the ends of the teeth are not sharp. They're rounded and there's a lot of kind of gouging going on in there. And I actually noticed that there was a little bit of it on the large synchronizer. So might have to replace this. But anyways, to get this out, we need to punch the drive shaft out of this through the back of the casing right there. So we're going to zoom in through the casing, and that's the shaft that we need to punch through, and we need to punch through here. So you need obviously a nice long punch. I would recommend a brass punch, just because it's a softer metal and you won't wind up damaging the shaft. On the back of the transmission, the reverse idler shaft, you'll see that the shaft in itself has a holding pin, so that's why you can't go that way. So we have to punch it out this way, far enough to where we can get a hold of the pin and the shaft and just pull the whole thing out. Okay, so not a lot of room to work with here, and the angle's awkward, but this this reverse idler shaft it's not in there, it's not pressed in there very hard. So you only need to tap it really lightly and it will start moving very quickly and very easily without a lot of effort. And then once you get to this point, you can pretty much wedge it out by hand. Okay, well maybe some people can wedge it out by hand or pull it out by hand. I can't, too weak. Alright, fine. Let's try something different. I'm going to use a wood punch. Alright, I've tried to wedge it out as far as I can and it just won't go any farther. So I'm just going to use my screwdriver punch. This is nothing more than a split pin. I don't want to do any damage to it. Alright, shaft is out. This thing is also in really good shape. A little bit of shininess, but nothing that I'd be concerned about. Pull out reverse idler gear. I'm going to try and pull it all out as a unit with the washers in place so the roller pins don't all fall out. Okay, so there again, thrust washer with the groove. That's kind of cool. I don't know what this thing is. So there's this inner brass looking shaft on the inside of this gear. Take note of the orientation that you pull this out of. So the larger part of the gear is facing towards the front of the housing. The thrust washers there. So there's two thrust washers. We only have two sets of pin bearings to replace. Thrust washers, let me see if they're the same as the other ones. No. The thrust washers for the reverse idler gear are same size. They do not have the flat edge to them, and the inner diameter is much smaller. Obviously I'm going to guess that the shaft on the reverse idler is smaller than, oh yeah, there's a big difference between there. So this is the reverse idler shaft. This is the counter shaft. I wanted to show you what I was talking about with this gear being replaced. You can see the teeth. These are the edges that mesh with the synchronizer for the first and reverse gear, since this is the reverse idler gear. These are really kind of ground down. They got a rough edge to them. So these things have seen some wear. Fortunately, I think I'm going to have to replace this gear. That's the stuff that you kind of want to look for when you open this thing up, is if there's any wear or tear on the teeth of the synchronizing rings or the synchronizing hubs or the gears themselves. And then that way you can figure out which needs to be replaced. Alright, went out and bought myself a pair of lock ring pliers. I want to give you a shot at what these things should look like. I'm kind of textured into them so that they can grip the pointed ends of the lock washer, but they're basically expanders. This one happens to be OEM Tools 25354. I'll put a link in the description. This is the main gear shaft, and I'm going to take off the first lock washer and show you what you should look for in regards to... Ow! That was a good example right there. These lock washers are on there with a fair amount of force, and you're expanding this pretty durable, as you can tell, very thick washer, and you saw the spark there, and that thing just impaled itself on my hand. That hurt. Wear eye protection when you're actually taking these things off. If you're not wearing it for other reasons, wear it for putting these things on, taking them off, because these things will come off like a rocket ship. I just happen to be lucky enough to have my hand above that. I'm going to try and give you a close-up of this. On the inside edge of the lock washer, and this one is very subtle, there's shaved off angle. And that shaved off angle is the one that you want to have pointing down into whatever you're putting the lock ring on. So just take note that when you remove your lock washers, pay attention to what that beveled edge is pointing towards, and then when you put that lock washer back on, do it in the same form. Next is the larger lock washer. This comes off a lot easier. I actually can't do it with the spanning pliers because it's just too much of literally a span between the two. But what you can do is you can take a screwdriver, flat-headed screwdriver, and just wedge it up and underneath and out. I'm not going to do that right now because I need to use this lock washer as my base when I put this on the press and press the bearing out. I don't need to replace this bearing. This thing is in great shape. I mean, it's silent, there's no wear on it, but I don't want to have to do this in 15,000 miles or 20,000 miles. I'd rather do this in 80,000 miles and replace it with a new one. Let's move on to the main gear shaft. I've determined that I'm going to have to replace the first and reverse synchronizer hub, just because, as I showed you earlier with the teeth on the reverse idler gear, the meshing teeth are ground down. They're supposed to be a beveled point, very similar to the way that the teeth are on your synchronizer rings. To do that, we have to start with the other side and remove that main lock ring. That was a lot more uneventful than the last one. Yeah, again, this has just a very slight beveled edge. That beveled edge points in, obviously, to the synchronizer. All right, let's get some better lighting in here, because now we're starting to get into the intricate parts of it. And we need to make sure that we have documented the orientation of each one of these pieces. So, as I'm going through this, I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to use this video to keep track of the orientation, but I'm also going to mark everything so that if these things do come apart, I already know how they were connected. So I'm just going to put a little mark here and a little mark here, so that way I know that when I take this synchronizer hub off, and this were to come out, you know, once I take this inner retaining ring off and the blocks, then I would be able to put this back together exactly how it was after I get it all cleaned up. Also, to note that if you look at the two sides of this first synchronizer, the raised edge is the one that actually points towards the front of the drive shaft. Behind that is your first blocking ring or synchronizing ring. So I'm going to test this thing out real quick. It grips really well. Spins nice and easy. Alright, so the teeth are still good on this. Next is our second gear. It doesn't look like it's got any specific special orientation. The one thing to note is on this second gear, that's really all it is. It's one big solid piece. I'm guessing this is some kind of an oil groove, maybe, to help circulate the oil, and that points towards the front of the drive shaft. into the back of the first synchronizer, and then it looks like we've got another lock washer, maybe? Yeah, right here. Okay, so now we have this lock washer that splits between the second and the third gear. After that, there is a spacing washer. Oh, interesting. Okay, this is a tabbed washer, and that tab, inner tab, goes into this inner hole in the drive shaft, the main drive shaft. Then you can remove your third gear. Just keep stacking that up. Third and last blocking ring. See how well that meshes. That one turns easily, even when I apply pressure. So what that's telling me is this one's kind of worn out a little bit. Doesn't seem much of a groove. No, that's still clean. So that's good. Even though I'm going to replace this last synchronizing hub, I'm going to mark it anyways. There seems to be a inner lock washer right here. Move that. This whole thing will just... let's try it this way. If you're going to do this and you want to save your synchronizing hub, do it with a ball peen hammer or some kind of a hammer with a nice rounded edge. Last thing you want to do is put a nice big dent in one of these teeth. One last piece on this main drive shaft is your main shaft spacer. Looks to be about 1/4 of an inch deep, thick, and all that does is just provide space between the shaft and the bearing. Public service announcement. Subscribe. Like and subscribe. Or dislike. Any one of the two. Helps me out, helps the Jeeping community out, helps the CJ7 community out. So now that we got all the gears taken apart, what I want to do is I want to take apart the reverse first gear synchronizer. Before you do this, what I would recommend is just marking the 3 tabs that the synchronizing hub gear slides on, just so that you have an orientation of what or where these pieces go back into place when you replace those. First, put on safety goggles, and then you just want to pry out this inner retaining clip. Then remove the blockers. I'm not quite sure what these things are called. If I get better with my vernacular. And then you can simply just separate the hub, the synchronizing hub. And that's all that's to it. These over time get worn. This might lose a little bit of tension. You might have some grooving in your teeth. Like you might be able to see here, I've got some grooves that are cut into these teeth just from it sliding back and forth and meshing. So I've ordered this new synchronizing ring or hub, so this will all be replaced. But this is always nice to have the orientation as to where things are supposed to go for future replacements. So assembling this thing is as easy as it was to disassemble. Start with your outer synchronizing ring, have your replacement teeth, your inner synchronizing ring, and your inner clip. Install or put back in your synchronizing ring, hopefully right in line with where we had marked the synchronizing ring before. Take your teeth and align those into the replacement teeth. Drop those right into that slot with the bump pointing out. And then install your retaining clip. And in it goes. We have just reassembled the first and reverse synchronizing hub. Second and third gear lock synchronizing hub is very much the same way. It's got these inner teeth. They're structured differently, and they have these inner clips that have a notch built into them. That notch just goes right up into the middle of one of the clips, and then you just put this back in. This is how it is on both sides. So you can see that the only real difference is the retaining clip. Let's take apart the shift control housing. This is actually fairly easy to do. I want to get these shift rails out and see what kind of condition the shift rails are in underneath this section right here. There's these little ball bearings called poppets with a spring underneath them. I ultimately want to get the top off of this thing so I can powder coat the top. First step to all of this is to remove the reverse switch. This is a 7/8 socket head. Reverse light switch has a ball bearing, kind of like a poppet in it. When the shift rail moves into that point all the way at its extension, then the shift rail pushes this in and completes the connection. Then you need to remove for this model in particular, this is just a filler cap. This is where your TCS would go. Now, if you want to ask me what the TCS stands for, I have no clue. There's also one of these on the Dana 300 transfer case that if you watch that other video, you'll see it. It's a very light duty aluminum cap, and it's just for that filler. There seems to be a rubber washer that goes on this thing as a seal. It'd be interesting to see if I can find a replacement for this. Then flip your housing over. Now, the one thing that you definitely want to do here is you want to take a visual reference where these are for reassembly. So you don't want to get these screwed up. If you do take this apart and you can't figure out which one is supposed to go to which, then just take whichever synchronizer you're trying to figure it out with, and put the synchronizer in there. So the second to third synchronizer hub obviously fits into the shift fork, and it's got a lot of play for the first and the reverse. But you definitely want to make sure you have the orientation of where the shift fork is in relation to the shift rail. Once you get that removed, then just to make your life easier, you want to put this into a vise. Not heavily into a vise, lightly into a vise. Just enough to hold it into place. You do not want to over tighten this. This is a cast iron casing, or you may be operating on like a T4 and it is cast aluminum. They're fragile. Be careful. Now at this point you should have your shift rails aligned to where they're in neutral. This gives you a good perspective on where neutral is. We're going to take out the second and third shift rail fork first. What you need to do is you need to rotate it out to release that poppet, then shift it down, and then towards the first and reverse shift rail. And then what that does is that exposes the offset roll pin at the top of the shift fork shift rail here. Take a 3/16 inch punch the roll pin all the way through. Are we through? Yes, we're through. You can slide it right off of the shift rail. So I'm going to take a mental note as to how this was oriented. It looks like the longer part of the arm is facing towards the center of the shift rail housing. Once you've removed the shift fork, what you want to do is you want to rotate the shift rail into a position to where you can feel that the poppet has released. See how it kind of pops, pop it. And then you take a soft metal punch and you're going to punch this rail, push this rail down through the bottom part of the housing. On the bottom part of the housing, which you may have noticed earlier, there are two caps. That cap will pop out once this shift rail comes in contact with it. So catch it as it comes out through the bottom. And my cap just dropped out and I didn't catch it. But there's your cap as it dropped through the bottom. You'll notice that this has a little bit of the concave piece that has the kind of the lightly curved up lip faces to the inside. Now I've gotten it to the point where the poppet is right at the edge of the top of the rail. I don't know if this thing's going to come flying out or not, so I'm going to go very slowly. Well, there you go. It's going to come out pretty quickly. So that spring released and the poppet is right there. See if I can get that out through that hole. Let's try a magnet. Yeah, alright. Looks like it's in really good shape. On the inside of that is the spring, and then there's your poppet spring. Rotate this out, and there. That is our shift rail. Take note of where the orientation, what the orientation is of this shift rail, and which shift rail it is. I'm going to mark it. I'm going to put a big old R on the top of it. So these are the grooves that the poppet ball rests in as you're shifting, which is really kind of interesting to see how the whole component system works. It's amazing to me. Take your shift rail, rotate it towards the outside here, out into this groove, and you can slide it up, and then you can slide it back towards the center, and that exposes the roll pin on this side. Take your 3/16 inch punch and punch the pin through the shift rail, shift fork, towards the center of the housing. If you go this way, it's going to wind up getting lodged in the side of the housing and you can't get it out. And out pops the roll pin. Now at this point, you're going to want to flip this over, rotate the housing back to the orientation that we had it before, and now we're going to punch and push the shift rail out. But again, to do that, you're going to need to shift that rail so that the poppet is released. Once you get that oriented, then you can very lightly just tap this thing through. Run away! Run away! So I just chase both these things down. So the shift rail cap came out the bottom, and then once that happened and the shift rail popped through, then the poppet just came bolting out through that hole. So just realize that this stuff's going to be under pressure, and unless you want to order a new poppet, you're going to want to find that. Remove your poppet spring, pull that through the hole. Keep track of all this stuff, bag and tag, release it from your vise, and you can pretty much just slide your rail off. Slide your shift fork off. Slide your shift rail out. I'm going to mark this one as in 2, 3. Now I just realized something when you take that last shift fork out and you're moving the housing around. There is a poppet that's right in between the two shift rails, right inside of this metal crossover that has been drilled through. And what that poppet does right there is different. Instead of a perfectly round one, it is a pill shape with a groove in the middle. And what that does is as your shift rails move up and down and exposes the groove in the shift rail, this poppet moves in accordance. So basically what it does is this is the locking mechanism so that you can only engage one shift rail at a time. So this is a really important piece. Alright, now we have our entire housing completely taken apart. All I need to do is run this through a mineral bath, get it all cleaned up, do some wire brushing, some degreasing, and we're going to powder coat this, and it's going to look really super cool too. Alright, that concludes part 1 of the T150 disassembly. To be honest with you, I was terrified to do this. There's something about taking apart an axle or a set of brakes, but a transmission to me was like this unobtainable goal. I guess what I'm trying to say to you is if I could do this, you guys can do this. And the really cool thing about that for me is that now I know that I can completely redo my transmission on the 79, the T150. Yeah, I could take what I've learned and do the T5 that's on my other Jeep, my 84. So I'm guessing that the T18, the T176, 177, T4 and T5 are all relative. I mean, I think the T4 and the T5 are a little bit more complicated because there's a lot more moving parts, but it's all the same principle. So this is really cool. I mean, imagine how much money I'm going to save, you're going to save, and now you can do it on your own. That's freaking cool. For part 2, we will put this all back together. Pay attention to that, and you can do this, man. I mean, this is really cool. I'm super excited about this. If you guys have got any builds or any thoughts, let me know. Put it in the comments. Like and subscribe. Let's keep this CJ7 thing going. And now that we're getting into the really cool stuff, I'm starting to think, all right, do I start rebuilding the engine? I don't know. I mean, I thought this thing was daunting, and it's not.